They can't track you anymore, and it's driving them insane. Those words alone settle into your spirit like a revelation you always felt but never fully understood until now. Because somewhere deep inside you, beneath the layers of growth, healing, and spiritual evolution, you already sensed that something had shifted, something fundamental, irreversible, and undeniably divine. And now the truth is rising. The moment you began transforming, the moment you outgrew the version of yourself that others built their entire strategy around, you became untraceable to the very eyes that once monitored your every move. You stepped out of the identity they tried to freeze you into. You stepped out of the expectations that were crafted to confine you. You stepped out of the emotional patterns they used like access codes to navigate your reactions. Without permission, without announcement, without a dramatic exit, you simply evolved. And in that holy, quiet evolution, something extraordinary happened. The version of you they relied on to predict your behavior disappeared. This is why their spirit is restless. This is why their mind is uneasy. This is why they whisper, speculate, gossip, and invent stories to fill the silence you now embody. Because for the first time in your life, you're not giving them anything to read, anything to decode, anything to latch onto. Your growth didn't just elevate you, it erased the old energetic fingerprints they used to track. The emotional footprints you left behind in past versions of yourself evaporated the moment you healed. There was a time when every emotion you felt was visible, accessible, and legible to people who had no business touching your inner world. You used to broadcast your stress without realizing it, display your exhaustion without meaning to, reveal your wounds without understanding that certain eyes were watching not with compassion but with calculation. You lived in a psychological glass house, unaware that others were using your transparency as a surveillance system. But life has chapters. Chapters where you surrender, chapters where you break, chapters where you rise, and somewhere between the breaking and the rising, you discovered your own power. You realized the cost of being so open, so emotionally available, so spiritually unguarded. You learned that not everyone studying you is trying to understand you, some are trying to predict you, and others are trying to control you. And the moment that truth crystallized inside you, the transformation began. You started growing in ways even you didn't fully recognize at first. The changes were subtle, a calmer reaction here, a clearer boundary there, a moment of silence where you once would have explained or defended yourself. A pause instead of a panic. A breath instead of a breakdown. A decision made from clarity instead of fear. These small shifts created a massive internal redesign, and that redesign dismantled their entire blueprint. They once operated off predictable patterns. If they said this, you would react like that. If they did this, your emotions would unravel. If they triggered a certain wound, you would respond in a familiar way. But healing rewrites the script. Healing neutralizes the triggers. Healing unplugs the power supply feeding their control. So when you grew past the pain that once shaped your reactions, they could no longer predict your behavior. And when insecure minds can't predict someone, they interpret that unpredictability as a threat, because unpredictability means lack of control. And lack of control is unbearable to those who relied on your old identity to feel powerful. This is the psychological truth at the core of your story. Insecure people don't fear your growth because it makes you better, they fear it because it makes you uncontrollable. When someone can map your breakdowns, anticipate your insecurities, and forecast your reactions, they feel superior, safe, dominant. But when you rise, when you become emotionally disciplined, spiritually grounded, mentally sharper, they lose access to the control panel they once used with ease. Their brain goes into survival mode, because unpredictability registers as danger. Your silence becomes suspicious. Your peace becomes intimidating. Your boundaries become offensive. Your stability becomes unsettling. Your growth becomes something they can't decode, and because they can't decode it, they fear it. You didn't become distant, you became disciplined. You didn't become cold, you became clear. You didn't disappear, they simply lost the ability to track the new, elevated, spiritually protected version of you. And now everything they once believed about you is collapsing. They're looking for the old you, the one who over-explained, the one who reacted instantly, the one who carried emotional open windows that anyone could climb through. But that you no longer exists. They're reaching into a space you no longer inhabit. They're calling out to a version of you that healed in silence, transformed in solitude, and ascended without announcement. Your transformation didn't just confuse them, it scrambled their entire operating system. Because people who rely on your weakness to anchor their confidence cannot survive your strength. And the moment you outgrew the identity they assigned to you, the moment you stepped into a higher frequency, the moment you embodied inner peace, you disappeared from their radar entirely. You became someone their insecurity cannot read, their ego cannot handle, and their expectations cannot contain. This is why they're spiraling. This is why they're uneasy. This is why their spirit feels disturbed when yours is calm. They're fighting the loss of a version of you that benefited them, and they're realizing that the evolved you is a mystery they have no access to. You've become unpredictable in the most divine way, because nothing is more threatening to an insecure mind than a person who has healed, awakened, and reclaimed their power. And you, chosen one, have done exactly that. You didn't just grow. You outgrew everything they used to track you with. And now the world must face the truth. They can't decode you, they can't access you, and they can't control what they can no longer understand. The moment you healed, you became unpredictable in a way that shook the very ground beneath the feet of those who once monitored you like a routine they memorized. They never expected your healing to come, not in the quiet way it arrived, not in the steady way it grew, not in the powerful way it dismantled the entire emotional map they once used to navigate you. They had built their confidence, their assumptions, even their manipulation strategies around the certainty of your reactions. Your anger was predictable. Your sadness was predictable. Your confusion was predictable. Your emotional vulnerability was so familiar to them that they treated it like a script they could rehearse and perform around. But healing does not come to preserve familiarity. Healing comes to disrupt patterns, to liberate you from emotional surveillance, to make you unreadable to the very people who benefited from your instability. And that is exactly what happened the moment you began doing the work inside yourself. Work they never expected you to do, work they hoped you would avoid forever. Your healing scrambled the blueprint they studied for years, the blueprint they depended on to predict your next move. They had you mapped through your wounds, through your fears, through your people-pleasing tendencies, through your eagerness to explain yourself, through your desire to make peace even at the expense of your own spirit. But when you healed, when you pulled your energy back into yourself, when you learned to breathe instead of break, when you learned to pause instead of panic, when you learned to think instead of react, the map dissolved. It ceased to exist. It burned in the fire of your transformation. They woke up one day expecting to access the old version of you, and instead found a landscape of silence, clarity, emotional neutrality, and spiritual discernment they were not prepared to handle. People who once monitored you through your emotional leakage suddenly found themselves staring into a version of you that offered no access, no entry point, no crack to slip through. It terrified them, not because you became cold or distant, but because you became centered. You became intentional. You became aware. And awareness is the death of manipulation. You stopped reacting in the ways they counted on. You stopped defending yourself against accusations built to trigger you. You stopped explaining your feelings to people who had no intention of understanding them. You stopped allowing emotional chaos to dictate your choices. And the moment you did that, you became unpredictable in a way that made their entire psychological strategy collapse. They were used to knowing what to expect from you, used to being able to push your buttons and watch the predictable chain reaction unfold. They thought they owned the script of your life because you once performed the same emotional responses over and over, unaware that they were studying you with the intent to control you. But when you healed, truly healed, you interrupted the script. You ripped out the pages they depended on. You rewired the emotional circuits they used to manipulate. And when they tried to press the same old buttons, nothing happened. Silence replaced the explosion. Peace replaced the panic. Clarity replaced the confusion. They were pressing triggers that no longer existed, expecting you to fall into patterns you had spiritually outgrown, and when you didn't, their sense of control evaporated. Your unpredictability came not from chaos but from wholeness. You didn't become erratic, you became aligned. You didn't become distant, you became discerning. You didn't become mysterious, you became healed. And healing will always make you unreadable to people who relied on your wounds to understand you. They lost access not because you closed doors, but because they could no longer match the frequency you now operate on. Their old tactics, their familiar emotional games, their subtle psychological traps, they all collapsed in the presence of your newfound stability. You stopped giving them the emotional performance they depended on, and the absence of that performance destroyed their surveillance system. They realized too late that they were never tracking your life, they were tracking your reactions. But now the version of you who reacted to everything is gone. The version who could be provoked so easily is gone. The version whose emotions were an open window into your private world is gone. You healed that part of yourself, and in doing so, you became a version of yourself that they cannot predict, cannot decode, and cannot reach. You are no longer reactive, no longer emotionally porous, no longer predictable in the ways they counted on. And that shift, the one that happened quietly, internally, spiritually, is what ultimately broke their ability to monitor you. The moment you stopped playing the old role, their entire surveillance collapsed. Because they weren't tracking you, they were tracking the version of you that lived in pain, that lived in fear, that lived in emotional vulnerability. And that version no longer exists. They lost track of you not because you disappeared, but because you transformed. You moved into a dimension where their old strategies cannot follow. You became a mystery to those who built their confidence around believing they understood you. And now, as you stand in your healed identity, you carry the one thing they never expected you to possess: the power to move without being traced, without being predicted, without being controlled. You became unpredictable, not because you changed randomly, but because you finally healed, fully, deeply, and powerfully. They lost access to your mindset the moment you decided you would no longer live as a reflection of your old wounds, and that shift struck them with a force they still haven't recovered from. You see, people who studied you weren't studying you out of love, admiration, or curiosity. They were studying you to predict you, to anticipate your movements, to position themselves in ways that benefited them at your expense. They memorized your wounds the way someone memorizes a map, tracing the routes of your insecurities, analyzing the rhythms of your emotional reactions, cataloging the patterns of your fears. Your wounds were their compass. Your instability was their leverage. Your confusion was their opportunity. They rehearsed strategies around the version of you that existed in pain, the version of you that apologized for everything, the version of you that over-explained, overgave, overextended, and overloved. They studied that version of you like a textbook they never expected to be updated. They thought that once they understood your weakness, they would always understand your direction. They believed your wounds were permanent, that your patterns were fixed, that your mindset was frozen in old trauma. They didn't know how wrong they were. Because what they could never anticipate, what they never factored into the blueprint, what their strategies could never account for, was your healing. Healing is not just emotional restoration. Healing is mental reprogramming, spiritual recalibration, identity resurrection. Healing rewrites your internal script from the inside out, and once the script changes, nothing about your behavior, your boundaries, your decisions, or your mindset follows the same predictable patterns. The problem for them is that they could only track behaviors. They could only measure what they could see, what you displayed, what you reacted to. They never had access to your mind. They only had access to the wounds that shaped it. And once those wounds healed, once the emotional leaks were sealed, once the narratives that once held you hostage were replaced with clarity and self-awareness, they lost the only access point they ever had. Your mindset shifted in ways that completely destroyed every strategy they once depended on. You started thinking differently. You started observing instead of reacting. You started choosing instead of defending. You started responding with intention instead of emotion. Your clarity sharpened. Your discernment deepened. Your inner world became structured, grounded, fortified. Suddenly, your identity wasn't built on wounds, it was built on wisdom. And wisdom is something they can't mimic, can't predict, can't manipulate. They rehearsed their lines for a version of you that no longer exists. They planned conversations, expected certain reactions, braced for outcomes you used to deliver automatically. But your healing interrupted their entire performance. When they expected guilt, you delivered silence. When they expected anger, you delivered detachment. When they expected confusion, you delivered clarity. When they expected you to chase validation, you gave them indifference. And when they expected to provoke you, you responded with nothingness, a neutral emptiness they didn't know how to navigate. This is when the shock hit them. They finally realized that the person they studied with such confidence had dissolved into a version of you they were never prepared to face. Their old strategies, once so effective, so reliable, so comfortably predictable, fell flat, failed instantly, turned useless in the presence of your evolved mindset. They kept trying to provoke old wounds, not realizing those wounds no longer controlled you. They kept trying to play mind games designed for the weaker version of who you used to be. They kept trying to use emotional shortcuts that used to work, unaware that healing closed every shortcut, sealed every entry point, destroyed every trigger they relied on. They kept knocking on doors you no longer lived behind. They kept calling for a version of you that has long since transformed. And standing in front of them now is not the wounded soul they memorized, but a spiritually upgraded, mentally fortified, emotionally disciplined version they cannot decode. Your healing didn't just shift your heart, it shifted your entire psychological architecture. It changed how you think, how you see people, how you analyze situations, how you interpret behavior. You no longer internalize what was never yours. You no longer carry burdens you were never meant to hold. You no longer respond from pain, you respond from peace. And peace is something that threatens people who thrived in your chaos. They can't track what they can't predict. They can't predict what they can't access. And they can't access a mindset that evolved beyond the wounds that once made you predictable. The irony is that they thought they were studying you, but they were studying your pain. And pain can be read, manipulated, and anticipated. But healing? Healing is unpredictable. Healing is private. Healing is internal. Healing is spiritual. Healing is divine. Healing is not something insecure minds can trace. They realized too late that every ounce of power they had was tied to your old patterns, your old injuries, your old emotional reflexes. Once those disappeared, so did their control. They are left with the haunting truth that the person they studied, the person they strategized around, the person they believed they understood so well, is gone. And that is what terrifies them, not your silence, not your distance, not your boundaries, not your new life, but the fact that you evolved into someone they cannot predict, cannot influence, and cannot manipulate. They lost access to your mindset the moment you healed, and now they are forced to confront the deepest truth of all. They never understood you. They only understood the unhealed parts of you. And now that those parts are gone, they have nothing left to read, nothing left to track, nothing left to control. The person they studied is no longer alive, and the version of you standing today is beyond anything they could ever prepare for. Your spiritual upgrade closed every entry point they once used to infiltrate your life, and that single shift dismantled their influence in ways they still don't fully understand. See, people who operate in manipulation don't necessarily need physical access. They rely on energetic openings, emotional vulnerabilities, spiritual gaps, and psychological cracks. They need you confused. They need you doubting yourself. They need you emotionally reactive. They need you spiritually asleep. Because influence only works where awareness is missing. But the moment you stepped into spiritual consciousness, everything changed. You began to understand energy, not just emotions. You began to feel intentions, not just hear words. You began to read frequency, not just behavior. And once you learn that every person carries a vibration, every interaction carries a signature, and every motive carries a frequency, you stopped falling for surface-level presentation. Old manipulation tactics became transparent, predictable, almost laughably weak. Your intuition sharpened in ways you can't even fully explain. It wasn't a skill you learned, it was a sense you remembered, a power that was always inside you but buried under trauma, noise, and emotional distractions. Your intuition began speaking louder than their manipulation. Your clarity became stronger than their confusion. Your perception became sharper than their deception. You started catching things before they happened. You started sensing shifts before they unfolded. You started recognizing patterns before they became problems. You noticed tone changes, energy drops, behavioral inconsistencies, the silent flickers of envy, the micro-expressions of deceit, the subtle emotional imbalances in others that they hoped you would never detect. Every tactic they once used, guilt, gaslighting, triangulation, emotional baiting, silent treatment, projection, ceased to work because your spirit now sees the mechanism behind the manipulation. Your boundaries didn't just strengthen, they became spiritual force fields. You finally learned that boundaries aren't walls, they are filters. They don't keep people out, they keep energy out. And because of that, every boundary you set wasn't just an emotional decision, it was a vibrational shift. Every time you said, "No," you raised your frequency. Every time you chose peace over reaction, you calibrated your spirit. Every time you refused to absorb someone else's chaos, you aligned your energy with clarity. And the moment your vibration elevated, their influence collapsed. Manipulators survive on energetic permission. Without that access, their tactics evaporate. What terrifies them most is that you no longer operate on the same frequency they used to influence others. You don't respond to fear, guilt, urgency, or chaos. You respond to truth, alignment, and peace. You don't engage in emotional tug-of-war. You walk away from the rope entirely. You don't resonate with low-level conversation, low-level motives, or low-level energy. You've evolved to a spiritual wavelength they can't reach, can't mimic, and can't manipulate. Where they operate is dense, heavy, shadowed, rooted in insecurity and ego. Where you operate now is elevated, light-filled, intuitive, rooted in awareness and purpose. And frequency mismatch is a spiritual law. Lower vibrations cannot influence higher ones. They can only attach to what they match. But you no longer match them. That is the real reason they lost access. Not because you blocked a number, not because you stopped responding, not because you distanced yourself physically. You ascended vibrationally. You rose to a frequency where their old entry points no longer exist. The doors they used to slip through, your loneliness, your doubt, your empathy, your desire to be understood, are now sealed shut by awareness and self-worth. Every energetic leak they exploited is now reinforced with spiritual armor. They can't sneak into a consciousness that is awake. They can't distort a mind that is aligned. They can't manipulate a heart that is healed. They can't dim a spirit that is activated. And the most devastating part for them? They can't track you anymore. Not because you're hiding, but because you're vibrating on a level their spirit cannot perceive. They don't have access to the dimension you're operating in. They can't decode your moves because your moves are no longer made from fear, pain, or survival. They're made from spirit, intuition, and purpose. You are no longer predictable because healed people don't operate from wounds. Elevated people don't operate from ego. Awakened people don't operate from illusions. They can't read a vibration they no longer vibrate at. They can't interpret intentions created in a dimension they've never entered. And they can't influence a soul that has remembered its own power. Their old access points are gone. Their influence is gone. Their illusion of control is gone. What remains is distance they didn't choose but now must accept. You evolved into a version of yourself they cannot reach. You closed the spiritual portals they once walked through with ease. You shut the energetic windows they used to climb through silently. And now, from the outside looking in, they're realizing the painful truth. They never had real access to you. They only had access to an unhealed version of you. And now that version is gone, they are locked out permanently. You outgrew their boxes long before they even realized you had slipped out of them. For years, people tried to confine you to labels that served them, not you, labels that made you easier to understand, easier to predict, easier to use, easier to underestimate. They called you too emotional because it helped them dismiss your intuition. They called you too naive because it allowed them to excuse their manipulation. They called you too soft because your compassion exposed their lack of humanity. None of those labels were reflections of who you truly were. They were projections of their own limitations. But those boxes, those categories, those definitions they assigned to you gave them a false sense of control. It made them believe they knew you. It made them feel they had you figured out. It made them assume they could anticipate your reactions, predict your behavior, and shape your decisions. What they didn't understand was that those boxes were never built to hold someone like you. You were never meant to be categorized, simplified, or reduced to a single dimension. Your soul was too expansive, your mind was too layered, your spirit was too ancient, and your purpose was too large for any narrow frame they tried to fit you into. And every time they thought they had you pinned down, every time they believed they had finally defined you, you were already shifting, evolving, transforming into a new version of yourself. You were already shedding another layer, breaking another limitation, shattering another internal ceiling. Every chapter of your life carried a version of you that was wiser, deeper, sharper, more aligned than the last. And because of that, the boxes they put you in became obsolete the moment you entered them. They didn't realize your emotional depth wasn't a weakness. It was a gateway to understanding human nature. They didn't realize your softness wasn't fragility. It was resilience wrapped in compassion. They didn't realize your vulnerability wasn't immaturity. It was courage in its purest form. You were never too emotional, you were intuitive. You were never too naive, you were open-hearted. You were never too soft, you were spiritually advanced. But people of limited awareness misinterpret depth as danger because they cannot meet it within themselves. They prefer shallow waters where they feel safe, where the illusion of dominance is easy to maintain. But you were the ocean. And no box can contain an ocean. Every layer of growth shattered the limits they tried to place on you. With each breakthrough, you broke a boundary they assumed you'd never cross. With every healing, you released an identity they depended on. With every evolution, you outpaced their expectations. You became a moving target, not because you were unstable, but because you were ascending. You became unpredictable, not because you were inconsistent, but because you were expanding. They couldn't keep up with your growth because they weren't growing themselves. They couldn't understand your transformation because they weren't transforming. They wanted you to stay who you used to be so their assumptions could stay valid. But you kept evolving, and their labels fell apart in your wake. Your spiritual growth made them uncomfortable. Your mental clarity made them uneasy. Your emotional intelligence made them insecure. You grew in ways they had no language for. You developed strengths they never expected. You stepped into a self-awareness that dissolved every illusion they ever had about you. And when a person is committed to misunderstanding you, every step you take toward your true self feels like rebellion to them. But you didn't break their boxes out of spite, you outgrew them naturally. Evolution was inevitable for you because your soul was built for expansion. You became multidimensional, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, intuitively. They didn't know how to track someone who wasn't one-dimensional. They didn't know how to categorize someone who didn't fit a single story. You became too layered for their assumptions, too fluid for their expectations, too dynamic for their narratives. One moment you were soft, the next moment you were strong. One moment you were reflective, the next moment you were decisive. One moment you were quiet, the next moment you were unstoppable. You embodied duality, depth, complexity. And people who rely on labeling others for emotional safety cannot comprehend someone who defies simple classification. Your evolution exposed their stagnation. Your expansion revealed their limits. Your transformation highlighted the fact that they were still operating from versions of themselves they refused to outgrow. They wanted you predictable because it made their life easier. They wanted you small because it made their ego feel larger. They wanted you labeled because it made your power feel manageable. But the truth is, they cannot categorize what keeps evolving. They cannot understand what keeps expanding. They cannot control what keeps rising. You became a constant unfolding, a soul that refuses to stay still, a spirit that refuses to shrink, a mind that refuses to be defined by past versions. You are too vast for their labels, too expansive for their perspectives, too spiritually advanced for their limitations. They can no longer frame you in narratives that no longer apply. They cannot hold you in boxes you have spiritually dismantled. And now, standing in your new identity, you can finally see the truth clearly. The boxes they gave you were cages, but you were always meant to fly. Your growth didn't just break their definitions, it made them irrelevant. You've outgrown every limitation placed on you, and you will continue to outgrow every label they try to resurrect. Because you were never meant to fit into a box. You were meant to transform into a force they cannot define. You stopped needing their validation, and that was the moment everything shifted. For so long, their approval held weight in your world. Their opinions shaped your decisions. Their reactions influenced your confidence. Their judgments tugged at your emotions. You didn't even realize how much power you had handed them, not because you were weak, but because you were human. You wanted to be understood. You wanted to be accepted. You wanted to be seen in the right light. And so you measured yourself through eyes that were never capable of seeing your full truth. Their approval became a compass you didn't recognize you were following. But there comes a moment in every chosen person's life when the soul rises higher than the noise, when the inner voice becomes louder than the external ones, when self-recognition becomes more important than external validation. That moment happened quietly inside you. It didn't announce itself with fireworks or dramatic declarations. It wasn't a sudden rebellion, it was an awakening. A soft, deep, spiritual shift where you finally understood that the opinions shaping your identity were coming from people who had never taken the time to understand themselves, let alone you. Their judgments weren't reflections of your worth, they were reflections of their limits. And when that truth settled into your spirit, something sacred aligned inside you. You stopped seeking affirmation from people who couldn't comprehend your journey. You stopped needing praise from individuals whose inner lives were ruled by insecurity. You stopped craving emotional approval from people who only validated you when it benefited them. You stopped needing their validation, and that was the moment everything shifted. For so long, their approval held weight in your world. Their opinions shaped your decisions. Their reactions influenced your confidence. Their judgments tugged at your emotions. You didn't even realize how much power you had handed them, not because you were weak, but because you were human. You wanted to be understood. You wanted to be accepted. You wanted to be seen in the right light. And so you measured yourself through eyes that were never capable of seeing your full truth. Their approval became a compass you didn't recognize you were following. But there comes a moment in every chosen person's life when the soul rises higher than the noise, when the inner voice becomes louder than the external ones, when self-recognition becomes more important than external validation. That moment happened quietly inside you. It didn't announce itself with fireworks or dramatic declarations. It wasn't a sudden rebellion, it was an awakening. A soft, deep, spiritual shift where you finally understood that the opinions shaping your identity were coming from people who had never taken the time to understand themselves, let alone you. Their judgments weren't reflections of your worth, they were reflections of their limits. And when that truth settled into your spirit, something sacred aligned inside you. You stopped seeking affirmation from people who couldn't comprehend your journey. You stopped needing praise from individuals whose inner lives were ruled by insecurity. You stopped craving emotional approval from people who only validated you when it benefited them. The compass you once carried, one that pointed outward toward their expectations, turned inward. Suddenly your decisions were guided by intuition, not fear. Your choices were directed by purpose, not people. Your worth came from self-awareness, not applause. You no longer shaped your life around what they wanted to see. You shaped it around who you were becoming. They felt this shift long before you fully realized it. They sensed your energy detaching from their influence. They noticed your reactions becoming calmer, your boundaries becoming firmer, your steps becoming more intentional. They saw that their disapproval no longer derailed you, their silence no longer crushed you, their opinions no longer redirected you. The emotional strings they used to pull so effortlessly no longer existed. They couldn't steer your heart. They couldn't shake your confidence. They couldn't manipulate your choices. You had unplugged from their emotional control panel. That's when the panic began. Because people who rely on controlling your emotions need you to doubt yourself. They need you to seek reassurance from them. They need you to look outward instead of inward. Your validation used to be their leverage. Your insecurity used to be their power source. But once your worth became internal, not external, they lost access to the emotional territory they once governed. Your stability confused them. Your confidence disturbed them. Your neutrality disarmed them. You weren't cold, you were grounded. You weren't detached, you were aligned. You weren't avoiding them, you were choosing yourself. This internal shift made you untrackable in ways they never anticipated. When your worth depended on their reaction, they could predict your next move. If they criticized you, you shrank. If they praised you, you bloomed. If they withheld approval, you worked harder. If they gave it, you relaxed. Your emotional environment was shaped by their behavior, so they believed they understood you. They believed they had you mapped out. They believed your sensitivity to their opinions gave them insight into your next steps. But when your internal compass activated, when you realized that your value was inherent, not earned, the entire map collapsed. They could no longer predict your decisions because your decisions were no longer based on fear. They could no longer influence your mood because your mood was no longer tied to their presence. They could no longer interpret your direction because your direction was spiritual, not emotional. You became a mystery not because you changed who you were, but because you stopped giving them access to the emotional coordinates of your identity. They cannot track a person whose confidence comes from within. They cannot categorize a person who validates themselves. They cannot manipulate a person who no longer requires approval to move forward. You became sovereign over your own worth, and that sovereignty made you untouchable. It made you unpredictable. It made you powerful in a way that threatens people who relied on your insecurity to maintain their comfort. Your worth is no longer handed out in pieces, waiting for someone else to assign value to it. Your worth is rooted, whole, unshakable. Independent of praise, unaffected by criticism, unmoved by opinion. You now move with a quiet confidence, one that doesn't seek validation but radiates truth. And this is why you became untrackable, because they can't follow someone who is no longer following them. They can't anticipate someone who isn't driven by their approval. They can't understand someone whose sense of self comes from a place they have never accessed within themselves. You stopped needing their validation, and in doing so, you freed yourself from their emotional gravity. You became guided by spirit, anchored in truth, and aligned with purpose. And now, no one can steer you away from who you are becoming, because you no longer look outward for direction. You have become your own compass, your own affirmation, your own authority. And that is a power they can't influence, can't categorize, can't predict, and can no longer track. Your peace became their surveillance nightmare, and they still don't know how to process it. For years, they relied on your emotional transparency to understand you. They studied your reactions, your tone, your stress, your urgency. They learned to read the tension in your voice and the heaviness in your posture. They assumed your openness was permanent. They believed your emotions would always betray your inner world. But something happened along your journey, something they never predicted. You learned the power of peace. Not the passive kind, but the kind that is cultivated, protected, and rooted in spiritual maturity. And that peace changed everything. It made you unreadable. It made you unshakable. It made you untrackable. You see, when someone is used to decoding your chaos, They don't know what to do once you start operating from clarity. When someone is used to provoking your fear, they panic when your spirit becomes still. When someone expects you to react, they don't know how to interpret your silence. Your calmness doesn't comfort them, it terrifies them. Because insecure minds depend on predictable patterns, and you erased every pattern they memorized. They watch you now and see nothing to manipulate, nothing to exploit, nothing to interpret. Your neutrality is a locked door they no longer have a key for. Your silence is a wall that blocks their access. Your emotional stability is a language they cannot understand. They can't decode you anymore, not because you're hiding, but because you're healed. They can't provoke you anymore, not because you're avoiding them, but because you've mastered self-regulation. They can't predict you anymore, not because you're switching strategies, but because you're no longer reacting from wounds. They're trying to track a version of you that doesn't exist. The old you responded. The old you explained. The old you absorbed energy that wasn't yours. The old you felt responsible for making everyone comfortable. But the new you moves through life with an internal quiet that disrupts their internal chaos. Your peace throws off their entire system because they relied on your storms to navigate their own emptiness. Your calmness disarms them. Your silence exposes them. Your groundedness invalidates their old tactics. They can throw shade, but it doesn't land. They can gossip, but it doesn't touch your spirit. They can provoke, but nothing inside you rises to meet the invitation. And that right there is what terrifies them most, your lack of response. Your peace is louder than any argument you could ever make. Your silence is more powerful than any explanation you could give. You don't need to defend yourself because your energy speaks for you. You don't need to react because your spirit is already elevated beyond their reach. The truth is, your peace forces them to confront themselves. Without your old emotional reactions to distract them, they're left alone with their own insecurities, their own projections, their own dysfunction. They can't use you as a mirror anymore, so they're forced to face their own reflection, and that is something they were never prepared for. You are no longer the emotional puppet they once manipulated. You've become a sanctuary they cannot enter, a frequency they cannot match, a presence they cannot read. You became calm in a world that thrives on chaos, and that makes you untrackable to those still addicted to drama. Your peace is your shield. Your stillness is your power. Your groundedness is your liberation. And now, the very thing you fought so hard to cultivate, your inner stability, is the very thing causing confusion, frustration, and paranoia in the people who once depended on your instability to feel in control. You stopped being an open book. You stopped broadcasting your inner storms. You stopped giving them access to your emotional climate. And without your chaos to monitor, they have nothing left to study. But the new you moves through life with an internal quiet that disrupts their internal chaos. Your peace throws off their entire system because they relied on your storms to navigate their own emptiness. Your calmness disarms them. Your silence exposes them. Your groundedness invalidates their old tactics. They can throw shade, but it doesn't land. They can gossip, but it doesn't touch your spirit. They can provoke, but nothing inside you rises to meet the invitation. And that right there is what terrifies them most, your lack of response. Your peace is louder than any argument you could ever make. Your silence is more powerful than any explanation you could give. You don't need to defend yourself because your energy speaks for you. You don't need to react because your spirit is already elevated beyond their reach. The truth is, your peace forces them to confront themselves. Without your old emotional reactions to distract them, they're left alone with their own insecurities, their own projections, their own dysfunction. They can't use you as a mirror anymore, so they're forced to face their own reflection, and that is something they were never prepared for. You are no longer the emotional puppet they once manipulated. You've become a sanctuary they cannot enter, a frequency they cannot match, a presence they cannot read. You became calm in a world that thrives on chaos, and that makes you untrackable to those still addicted to drama. Your peace is your shield. Your stillness is your power. Your groundedness is your liberation. And now, the very thing you fought so hard to cultivate, your inner stability, is the very thing causing confusion, frustration, and paranoia in the people who once depended on your instability to feel in control. You stopped being an open book. You stopped broadcasting your inner storms. You stopped giving them access to your emotional climate. And without your chaos to monitor, they have nothing left to study.